alle bei dem Vortrag des heutigen Abends hier im Centre Marc Bloch sehr herzlich begrüßen. Wie Sie wissen, ist das Centre Marc Bloch ein deutsch-französisches und interdisziplinäres Forschungszentrum auf dem Gebiet der Geistes- und Sozialwissenschaften. Eine der Hauptaufgaben des Centres besteht auch in der Förderung und Ausbildung von Nachwuchswissenschaftlerinnen und Wissenschaftlerinnen und Wissenschaftlern aus Deutschland und Frankreich, aber auch aus weiteren Teilen Europas und der Welt. Und ich freue mich, dass viele Studenten heute Abend auch anwesend sind. Es ist eine besondere Freude, dass der heutige Vortrag in Zusammenarbeit mit dem Humboldt College Berlin stattfinden kann. Es ist das erste Mal, wo unsere beiden Institutionen zusammen kooperieren und ich freue mich sehr darüber. Sowie auch über die Tatsache, dass viele der Studenten dabei heute Abend sind. Ich möchte insbesondere Frau Atanasow sowie Frau Thul, den auf Bord College Berlin, begrüßen und dafür herzlich danken, dass Sie diese Kooperation ermöglicht haben. Ich begrüße ebenfalls Frau Eisenberg, Direktorin des Centre for British Studies der Humboldt-Universität, sowie unsere weiteren Gäste. Der Anlass für diese Zusammenarbeit könnte mit dem Gast des heutigen Abends, Halévi, unserem Kollegen vom CNRS und an der École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, nicht passender sein. Halévi, wie Sie wissen, der eng mit François Furet zusammengearbeitet hat, ist einer der international anerkanntesten Historiker der Französischen Revolution. Mein Kollege im Centre, Daniel Schönpflug, wird Halévi ausführlicher vorstellen und ich wünsche Ihnen einen spannenden Abend.
Good evening. On behalf of Bard College Berlin, I also want to welcome you to this first cooperation with Centre Marc Bloch and say a little bit about the context of this evening. This is part, this lecture is part of a larger initiative on hate and the human condition that was launched this year by the Hannah Arendt Center in collaboration with Bard's Center for Civic Engagement and the Human Rights Project. And the idea behind this initiative is that, on the one hand, there's a recognition that hate is an important, dramatic, and often destructive force, and yet one that is very little studied and poorly understood, and that we need to understand hate better, and perhaps more generally, the human condition better, in order to be able to perhaps do something about it. So it's an initiative that combines theory and practice. It wants to foster the academic study of divisive passions and hate in particular, and on the other hand reach out to the world of practice and perhaps create some kind of bridge between theoretical inquiry and practical engagement. I'm very grateful to Halévi for agreeing to speak to us about this and a very particular aspect of hate. This evening I'm especially grateful to Marc Bloch Center and to the Director, Patrice Veit, and especially to Daniel for embracing this, for embracing this idea and making it happen. I also wanted to say thank you to Irina Stelea and Juliane Hübner who were involved in overseeing the organization, and of course to all of you for being here tonight. Now I leave the mic to Daniel to introduce our speaker.
Yes, thank you, Eva. So I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished speaker, Halévi. And when I say distinguished speaker, it's not just a formula that I'm using for the sake of being conventional. Halévi actually has distinguished himself by his work and by the role he plays in academia and outside of academia. And he is, and I'm trying to highlight this in my brief introduction, in some respect maybe distinct from other French historians or from other historians in general. Halévi is a Directeur de Recherche at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, which is, as you probably all know, one of the most prestigious research institutions in the world. Some of the most prominent French scholars teach or taught, such as Jacques Le Goff, Fernand Braudel, Jacques Derrida, Pierre Bourdieu, to cite only a few very particularly famous names. But it's not only by being at the École that Halévi has distinguished himself in a distinguished group of colleagues, but also with a long series of important publications, such as in 1984, his doctoral thesis, Les loges maçonniques dans la France d'Ancien Régime, published at Armand-Collin. The book takes off from a basic political assumption of the time, of the 18th century, which was that the French Revolution was a Masonic plot. This is, of course, not a thesis that can be taken academically serious, but it can inspire research. And it did inspire research in Halévi's case, because he worked through the thrilling question how Masonic sociability, sociabilité, influenced, prefigured in a way, revolutionary political culture. A very important book. And as you can see, already in this first bigger work, there is some kind of a sense for the back and forth between the political or public realm and the academic research. And it was maybe because of this interest in relations between the political and academic sphere that Halévi was attracted to François Furet. I am only guessing this. He's here to speak about this maybe himself. But as Furet's student, he became part of one of the most influential academic and intellectual movements that challenged France since the 1970s, and that became known as the revisionist school of the French Revolution. In the study of the French Revolution, this school, based at the Centre Raymond Aron, was fundamentally opposed to, at the time, dominant interpretation, which was a Marxist interpretation. Frontally attacking this orthodox reading, the revisionists were claiming that the French Revolution was not mainly a social and economic phenomenon, but and I cite, the creation of modern political culture, as the title of an important collection of books put it. At the same time, the revisionists were active on the public scene in France, working for a new anti-totalitarian left against the still powerful Communist Party of the late 60s and 70s. Halévi has participated in many of the major intellectual enterprises of the revisionist school. I can only mention one here, the Dictionnaire critique de la Révolution française, edited by François Furet and Mona Ouzif, which is far more than just an ordinary dictionary where you can look up things that you don't know, where you can find facts. It rather is a long, learned, and very thoughtful collection of essays that aim to resume a new interpretation proposed by the revisionists. Halévi contributed 4 of the major articles of this critical dictionary. Generally speaking, the dictionary takes a certain distance toward the events of 1789, and it draws an ambivalent picture of the revolution that on the one hand brought freedom and democracy, on the other hand triggered dictatorship and massive violence. Understanding the French Revolution in this perspective always means understanding the fragility of modern democratic regimes that often stem from revolutions, but are also likely to be altered or even swept away by them. Halévi is also distinguished insofar as he, like Furet, has never restricted himself to the academic sphere. He shares his political observations with a wider public, be it on the pages of Le Figaro or on the waves of France Culture, commenting on intellectual issues, but also on political events, be it in France, US, or Israel. Halévi is, moreover, a French historian that has sought to look at France from an outside perspective, which distinguishes him at least from some of his colleagues. He accepted invitations as a visiting professor at the universities of Michigan and Chicago, and this has given him opportunity to see France from abroad. It seems to me that Halévi's lecture tonight is a reflex of many of these impulses that have shaped his intellectual life. To reflect on hate in revolutions is not only innovative from the methodological point of view, as emotions have not played a great deal in its interpretation, but it is also an approach that, again, helps us to understand the ambivalences, if not the dangers, of revolutions, that are often welcomed too naively and enthusiastically as the dawn of a new age. Halévi, thank you so much for coming. We are most curious to listen to your lecture. The floor is yours.
I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to my hosts, Bard College in Berlin, and especially to Eva Tanasso for their invitation, and to the Centre Marc Bloch for co-hosting this event. It is, I feel particularly honored to deliver this lecture under the auspices, so to speak, of both the man and the historian Marc Bloch have been. Eva Tanassov induced me, I'm not a hate specialist, but Eva induced me to reflect on the revolutionary spirit in relation to the no less inflammatory notion of hate. You obviously find both throughout the French Revolution, but finding does not mean necessarily understanding. And indeed, the approach of these two themes generates the same kind of puzzlement and difficulty. I've been working for some time on the revolutionary spirit, then hate came into, and I found that they generate the same kind of difficulty and puzzlement. Neither has become an autonomous subject of research. The revolutionary spirit is a very familiar notion, but it has not been, like hate, an autonomous subject of research. And both notions are as familiar as they appear largely elusive. There is no common, agreed perception either of hate or of the revolutionary spirit. And in the introductory essay released by the Hannah Arendt Center, one can read, hate, it seems, is a complex state of mind. It is an emotion. It is also an idea. It is an attitude. It is a behavior. It is rationalization. It is a driving force. Replace hate, and you have, by a revolutionary spirit, and you encounter the same elements and the same puzzlement. The revolutionary spirit is by no means reducible to hatred, but hate is by no means absent from the revolution. And as we shall see, hate is an intrinsic attribute of the revolutionary spirit. Think of the hatred of the old regime. The old regime is not only an historical reality or historical sequel, it is an ideological construct, a revolutionary notion that pervaded the revolutionary spirit. Tocqueville captures this at the very opening pages of the old regime and the revolution. He writes, in 1789, the French made the greatest effort ever undertaken by any people to dissociate themselves from their past and to put an abyss between what they had been and what they wished to become. They took all kinds of precautions to bring nothing old into the new order. They created the old regime as a negative image of the revolution. And think also the hatred of aristocracy, the hatred of tyrants, the hatred of the counter-revolution, or even, this is less known, well known, the hatred of moderation. From 1789, moderation is assimilated to the treason of principle, and it is represented by a group that was called the Monarchiens, the first moderate of the revolution, that the first vanquished of the revolution, that are deemed, right, are opposed in a hateful, with a hateful vocabulary and in a hateful way. After the defeat in September, October 79, you can see Brissot. Brissot would be a prominent Girondin revolutionary. At the time, he's a journalist. He pursued his revolutionary career outside the National Assembly because he was not elected to the National Assembly. But Brissot, in his writing, daily writing, has a journal. It's very apprehensive about moderation. And he, in a way, expresses, I would say, a structured hatred of moderation. He said, I dread the moderates under this guise more than when they display their knives in the open. And the same under the terror. During the terror, there is a new word that is invented, which is called modérantisme. It disappeared from French vocabulary or from French dictionary, but it's an invention of the revolution. And modérantisme in 1793 is assimilated to capital felony. Robespierre in May 1794 denounces the two first National Assembly as too corrupt to a certain Republican principle of having conspired to conceal under the perfidious column of moderation a criminal endeavor that leads to tyranny. Modérantisme is a hateful notion under the terror. Saint-Just assimilates modérantisme to the disimplication, this crime of not being implicated, that craven pleasure of not being involved. In his famous report on the revolutionary government in October 93, he says, you should punish not only the traitors, but also those who are indifferent. You should punish whoever is passive in the revolution. Passivity, modérantisme, moderation, is a hateful feature of counter-revolution. There is a revolutionary catechism which is published at the same time under the terror, where you can read, whoever entertained moderate opinions in the midst of revolutionary turmoil should be deemed an enemy. Moderation is a crime against humanity. Well, they didn't mean exactly the same thing when they talked about crime against humanity, but you have a structured hatred of so many things as the revolution goes on. These are only examples, but they are enough to ask the question that, or to reframe the question that the Hannah Arendt Center posed about hate. Are these expressions of hate purely personal or mainly political? Where one should draw the line between the former and the latter, can they be separated? And I don't think we still have a clear answer to that. Hate is obviously, as I said, a component of the revolutionary spirit from 1789 onwards, but it does not exhaust the meaning of the revolutionary spirit. The revolutionary spirit is not only about hate. It's about something larger and more complicated. It only adds to the difficulties of grasping the nature, the tenor, the attributes, the scope of what we commonly call today the revolutionary spirit. There is a difficulty is that we do not agree entirely about what the revolutionary spirit means, that we don't agree entirely on what global history means, right? But this notion has been, for more than 2 centuries, the fellow travelers, I would say, a French national narrative. Everybody talks about the revolutionary spirit. It's both a familiar and an elusive notion. It is often used, but is rarely defined. And it has very rarely been studied. We have many books or many studies about revolutionary festival, some about revolutionary ideology, some about Jacobinism, we even have books on the sensibilité révolutionnaire, about terror, revolutionary terror. But we don't have a lot. We have near to nothing about the revolutionary spirit. It's something which is obvious, but which has never been a subject of real study. Try plugging the word revolutionary spirit into the search engine of French Revolution catalog, and you would come up with, indeed, next to nothing. I see only 2 books that bear the title of revolutionary spirit. One was published in 1878 about the revolutionary spirit before the revolution, but it doesn't deal at all with the revolutionary spirit. In fact, the book is about the crisis of the old regime, and it's a very good book about the crisis of the old regime, but it has little to do with revolutionary spirit. And the second is a book that was published in 1972 by the Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, which is called The Revolutionary Spirit, and which in a sense examines the revolutionary spirit in a very useful way, even to an historian of the French Revolution, in relation to totalitarianism. Let me now present 2 general reflections about the revolutionary spirit. First of all, the study of the revolutionary spirit should not begin in 1789. It's not an invention or a creation of the French Revolution. And some of the sources of revolutionary spirit can be traced back to the 18th century or even earlier. That is, the passion for equality, for example, the principle of national sovereignty, the mistrust of any form of checks and balances, and so forth. All these elements are already in circulation before 1789. But it is too vast a subject that I will not be able to address here. The second reflection, or the second, I would say, cautionary remark, would be that the revolutionary spirit does not bring, or did not bring about the revolution. That's not the author of the revolution. I don't mean by revolutionary spirit the author of the revolution. It is rather the vehicle or the fuel of the revolutionary process, which is something entirely different. What I would like to try to do here, it is a kind of a work in process with bringing in the same elements. So asking a new question with all material. So I would like to do 3 things. To try, with more or less success, to characterize the revolutionary spirit. And then to relate the revolutionary spirit to two of its constitutive elements. One is suspicion, and the second is indeed hate. So let's begin with some distinctive attributes of what we call the revolutionary spirit. First of all, let's see what the revolutionary spirit is not. It is not an ideology or an ideological system. It's not a political doctrine, coherent, structured. It's not even a political program. If you see those who vehicle the revolutionary spirit in the first years of the revolution, EHESS, Mirabeau, the Triumvir, the Girondins later, Robespierre, they're very different people with very different agenda. They are actors in producing the revolutionary spirit, but they don't share the same program. So what may characterize the revolutionary spirit is, first of all, the enemies they designate. Everything that can be assimilated to the old regime: privilege, social hierarchy, absolute power, intermediary bodies, checks and balances, and especially aristocracy, counter-revolution, the monarchy, and indeed moderation. Let's make a step further. The revolutionary spirit can be compared to a political idiom. It's a particular way of being a revolutionary, of conceiving politics as an ongoing struggle between the revolution and its enemy. The enemy is a fundamental element that structures the revolutionary spirit. To use Pierre Bourdieu's, one of Pierre Bourdieu's favorite notion, but it's a very good notion in point, one may say that the revolutionary spirit is a political habitus. Or if I were Jacques Le Goff, I would say c'est un trait de mentalité. It's a form of mentality. You see, we're still in the vague or in a general perception, and we'll try to make a step further. The revolutionary spirit can be an impure mélange of several elements: political principles, ideological passions, partisan prejudices, and a mode of identification to a cause. Principles, passion, prejudices, identification. What principles? The principles are not fixed once and for all. There is one intangible principle that goes throughout the revolution, which is one of the main, I would say, vehicle of revolutionary spirit, which is, of course, the principle of equality. And one of its variants is the hatred of hierarchy, the hatred of privilege, and extended to the hatred of aristocracy. The other will take hold of the revolutionary spirit only progressively, the other principles: national sovereignty, slowly, not at the outset of the revolution, the republican principle, and later on, direct democracy. Hence the difficulties. The revolutionary spirit is something easily recognizable. When you read the text of those actors, you can see immediately who can be associated, identified with it. But it is also something polymorph, elusive, shifting, unsettled. One thing we may say about the revolutionary spirit, trying just to settle it or to put it in context, that it is not reducible to the naive notion of causality between philosophical idea and political action. A long time ago, people used to say that the revolution is just the result of Enlightenment philosophy. First, the philosopher set on the ideas, then the revolution made the execution. You can't create this kind of causality for the revolution. You can't do it for the revolutionary spirit. The agent of the revolutionary spirit are much more conspicuous about their political foes than about their own revolutionary agenda. People can be in this mouvance from early on in the revolution without being very clear to themselves about their political agenda. Once again, the enemy defines the revolutionary spirit and shapes the revolutionary spirit much more than a very clear set of political ideas or political ends. Many people arrive at Versailles without a political program, constructed political program that they would just put into action. So what we may say about this question of causality between ideas and political action is that the revolutionary spirit takes shape at a crossroad. And that is perhaps the most important thing, between ideas and concepts that are in circulation already before the revolution, and on the other hand, political circumstances and political necessities. It is, the word in French perhaps is stronger than crossroad, une rencontre between, I would say, the offer of ideas and the demand of circumstances. What circumstances? Here we come to really a classical history of the French Revolution, but sometimes it's good to revisit the classical history of the French Revolution and to try to understand how it produces this revolutionary spirit. A fundamental moment, a fundamental feature of the revolution, which is not the one which is more popular in textbook, is the conflict between the three orders. It's a banal thing, the conflict between the three orders at the very beginning of the Estates General, which exacerbates very quickly the hatred of aristocracy, and which transform, this social hatred very soon into a political hatred. I'll talk about it later. So we have, on the one hand, the conflict between the orders, third estate against the nobility and a part of the clergy. And then another element, which is fundamental, which intervenes a little bit later, is the conflict between the third estate and royal power. It is a conflict with which, here again, it's a banality, but it's not used, I would say, properly, very often by the historian of the revolution. That was not expected. People didn't, many delegates of the third estate could anticipate a conflict, a fierce conflict between the third estate and the nobility, but most of them did not anticipate a conflict between the third estate and royal power. And I think that the conflict between the third and the royal is the one that triggers most what I will describe later, the pathology of suspicion. We have to imagine how this revolution begins. You know, in textbook, when you read, a child will ask, when does it begin? Give me a date. We don't have a good date about the beginning of the French Revolution, because the beginning of the French Revolution still remains something rather elusive. What we need to know is that these two conflicts, the one between the orders, then between the third estate and royal power, which was not expected and was not anticipated, occurred in a context which is invaded by contingency, confusion, political inexperience, boldness, a lot of miscalculation. These are moments where everybody tried to calculate its next step without knowing what it would produce. That is the context where these conflicts come about. And this is the confused background where precisely in 1789 the revolutionary spirit takes shape. And I'm trying to progress a little more in trying to locate its birth and add some, or offer some characterization of it. And on that, I must say that Kolakowski is very useful, although he has in mind totalitarianism and not at all the French Revolution. One of the fundamental attributes of the revolutionary spirit is, it sounds very bad in English, an absolute perception of politics, or I would say the essentialization of politics. I'll try to be more explicit. As Kolakowski says, it's the alternative between total salvation and total serfdom. That is an absolute view of politics. And it applies to the French Revolution very early on. The notion that the existing world is totally corrupted, useless. The idea that either you destroy everything or you, in a way, give in. Or the notion that total destruction should be followed by a total reconstruction anew. That idea that all traces of a corrupted past are threatening. They threaten to contaminate, to corrupt this earth of reconstruction, once again in relation to the past. And in a sense, is the notion he suggested about totalitarianism is going back to the state of nature. And you know that Kant, in his description of the regicide, talks about getting to the state of nature, declaring war and reconstructing something entirely new. Now, the revolutionary spirit embraced progressively, very slowly, this total or totalizing vision of politics. It was progressively invaded by this vision. It was not born that way. But the seeds of this total vision appear early on through the substitution of one sovereignty to the other, national sovereignty to the sovereignty of the king, through the abolition of what is called then the feudal system, and through the construction of ideological construction of this notion of the old regime, this idea that the revolution begins on a clean slate, that nothing from the past can be retrieved in order to recreate the present. And the last element that may characterize or help characterizing the revolutionary spirit is a distinction that I borrow from Carl Schmitt, the notion of politics, the idea of friend and foe. You know, this idea was, well, it's an adaptation of this idea that comes from the notion of politics that Carl Schmitt wrote in 1938. In a sense, I would say that the revolutionary spirit reproduced this dreadful logic of cleavage and classification. It's a machine that creates and recreates the enemy. The revolution builds, I would say, its dynamic on the notion of total friends, total allies, and total enemies. All kinds of enemies. Enemies from without, that is the counter-revolution, but also the idea of enemies from within. That is, all these traitors to revolutionary principle, the moderate, the indifferent, the misled, the hypocrites, the corrupted, that Saint-Just denounced in the passage I quoted. Enemy from without, enemy from within, enemy who is visible, but enemy who can be hidden in within, dissimulated, enemy who is enemy of the revolution without knowing he is an enemy of the revolution. what is dreadful in this logic of friend and foe is that everybody is potentially suspected, and that people can be suspected not only by acts and words they utter, they can be suspected because they don't utter words and they don't act. They can be suspected not only by what they refuse, they can be suspected because they accept. Their acceptance of the revolution may be seen as suspicious. We'll get back into that. So this is precisely the logic that structures the revolutionary spirit at the earliest stages of the revolution, in relation both to royal power on the one hand and to aristocracy. And this is where come into play the two driving sources of revolutionary pathology, that is suspicion and hate. So let me say now a few words about suspicion. The first crystallization of the revolutionary spirit coincides with the very first act of the revolution, which is the proclamation of national sovereignty. If we need to give a date, if we have to designate an act, it's a political act. It's a political act that doesn't name itself. It's the day where the National Assembly, well, the State General calls itself National Assembly. And there is a question, a fundamental question, how does the principle of national sovereignty prevail? The idea of national sovereignty was not widespread among the delegates of the Third Estate when they come to Versailles. They don't think in terms of national sovereignty. That is a very interesting thing. They come to Versailles in a way with the idea that France they are invited to come to Versailles to reshape or to give France a constitution. They know that there will be a conflict between the orders because the nobility want to deliberate separately and to hold to its privileges. So they come with the idea that there will be a conflict between Third Estate and nobility. They do not expect to become a national assembly, that is, to dispossess the king from his title as the absolute sovereign and to replace him by a new kind of sovereignty. At the beginning of the revolution, the king is rather popular. Necker, his prime minister, is even more popular. The king is not part of the fighting that people are expecting to follow. Everything is focalized about the form of deliberation. So, where do we stand with the question of national sovereignty in 1789? Well, for many of the leaders of the Third Estate, the notion that the nation is the sovereign, that king is not a sovereign, that the king in a way is subordinate to national sovereignty, is an idea that is quite widespread. Among the leader of the Third Estate, we have many writings witnessing to that. There are many pamphlets that talk about national sovereignty. But there is a, how should I say, what you think theoretically doesn't necessarily translate into practice. They come with this notion that the nation is sovereign. They convene to decide to give a constitution. Nobody comes with a clear revolutionary agenda of dispossessing the king of his sovereignty and proclaiming the nation as sovereign, and proceed to write a new constitution based on this principle. There is one person who has this conviction, has this program, He's called Sieyès. He's one of the leaders of the third estate, but many others don't reason in these terms. Second, even Sieyès does not imagine that the very first act of the third estate, or the revolutionary act of the third estate, will be the proclamation of national sovereignty. There is no revolutionary scenario written in advance, even in people's mind, that is executed once they come to their side. What produces this first revolutionary act is the deadlock of the Estates General, and on the other hand, the awkwardness of Louis XVI. It's these two elements that open the way to the revolution of sovereignty. The revolution of sovereignty is a product of, I would say, circumstances, contingency, with the help of some fundamental notion that are already in circulation and on the eve of the revolution. Louis XVI is a weak monarch, and is a weak monarch especially in the midst of turmoil. The court is extremely divided. We have always to imagine, when we try to understand how a political event is produced from the diverse element that produces it, and how a revolutionary spirit comes into being. Well, in this context, he must be a decisive force, because he convinced the Estates General he can't do otherwise. The situation of the country is in big crisis, there is an economic crisis, a budget crisis. But if he doesn't lead, I mean, the event that of which he is the author, he is in trouble. And in a sense, he doesn't give any guideline to the revolution that will occur. So we have to mention here 4 dates that are fundamentally important. The one in 17th of June, in order to vanquish the nobility, the third estate declares himself the nation. And while declaring itself the nation, the third estate operates an immense revolution. Look how the revolution of sovereignty occurs. They are in conflict with the nobility, but in order to vanquish the nobility, they say, we are the nation. When they say, we are the nation, they say, we are the delegate of the sovereign. The sovereign is the nation. This is an immense revolution. But we are not enough attentive to the notion that this immense revolution has occurred through a conflict between the order, at the expense, I would say, of the king. What is also very important to know is while this revolution of sovereignty occurs, nobody mentions the word sovereignty. The one who really drives this revolution is Sieyès, that I mentioned already. But even he doesn't utter the word sovereignty. This is too, I would say, too frightening a word. Tell a peasant in France, tell even a delegate of the third estate who is not versed in the political ideology that the sovereign is the nation. He might be surprised, but he will have a lot of difficulty of assimilating such a huge notion. So you see that in 17th of June, something very bizarre happens. In order to fight the nobility, or to vanquish the nobility, the third estate declares itself the nation. In a way, it dispossesses the king, which is an immense act of sovereignty, but it doesn't yet mention the word sovereignty. And here the kings come into the picture by ordering the orders in June the 23rd to reunite, trying to cancel or cancelling the revolution of June the 17th without himself understanding entirely or completely what really had happened. But he's disobeyed. The members of the third estate, of the assembly, stay where they are. Some of the members of the clergy join them. Some of the members of the nobility join them. And 4 days later, the king orders all the orders to gather together. In a sense, without recognizing the revolution, he recognizes the revolution of the sovereignty. He recognizes, not officially, by his order to gather together, his own political destitution. Third date is, of course, the Bastille. Once again, the king dismisses his ministry, and that creates such an emotion in Paris and elsewhere in Versailles that you have an urban insurrection that is sustaining a political revolution nobody, well, many people are not entirely aware of. So, and then you have the October Days. The October Days, there is very little written about the October Days, by the way. The October Days are a very particular moment. There are two events in October. One is very well known. There are troops that are coming to Versailles to help the king. And that threat produces huge emotion in Paris. So a huge amount of people from Paris, in circumstances that are not very clear, walk on Versailles, bring the king to Paris, and from then on the king will be in a sense captive in Paris. But what also happens is that the assembly at that moment submit to the king some of its first decision for ratification. The king refuses, and he ends up accepting. Once again, he is defeated. So, in what sense these very dramatic events feed the revolutionary spirit and fuel the pathology of suspicion? The answer is that the revolutionary spirit is shaped by the ongoing showdown between the old and the new sovereign, and the image each of them has of its own forces and weaknesses. The king thinks, progressively he discovered, that he is dispossessed by what he deems a usurpation. He tries to vanquish the revolutionary with the troops, with force, and then he gives up. But this dispossessed king is still there. He doesn't leave the scene. He cannot leave the scene. The revolutionaries cannot do without a king. But the question they ask themselves is what they do with this king. What they can do with a dispossessed king who is still in the midst of a revolution that had dispossessed him. The assembly has a fragile triumph. First of all, these delegates were summoned to Versailles not to make a revolution, not to replace one sovereign with another, and not to become a constituent assembly. They came to help the king reshape the constitution. And it turns out that they make a huge revolution. They destroy or they dismiss the old regime. They make of their king the ex-absolute king a subordinate force. What is fragile in this revolution is that, as I said, all through these days, they feel themselves threatened for good reasons. The king has the troops, the king has the country. They cannot anticipate what would be the answer of the country. There is an exchange between Mirabeau and Sieyès. He said, in 3 days, he'll bring the troops and we'll be just dismissed and go away. This fragility feeds their radicalism. And this fragility of the assembly, of the new sovereign, is one of the constituent elements of the revolutionary spirit. The idea or the hesitation about their own legitimacy. They have a vulnerable legitimacy that feeds naturally the revolutionary spirit. And there is another thing. They vanquished an enemy or enemies, nobility and king. They are not entirely sure that their vanquished enemy will let it go. They live with the notion that the vanquished wait for their moment. They live with the notion that no absolute, ex-absolute king would consent to his fate. Why should he? And he doesn't, by the way. But we know the private correspondence of Louis XVI. He would never consent to the fate that was imposed upon him. So the revolutionary spirit is fed continuously by, I would say, the assumption, which is not an absurd assumption, that the vanquished would not accept their fate. And there is a last thing that we can remind ourselves of, and which is never mentioned in histories, whatever history was the French Revolution, is that there is a huge political class that has vanished in about a few days in 1789. Imagine that all the political class in Germany, from one week to another, disappear. You have new people. People who governed France for, well, centuries, but these people didn't live for centuries, but for decades, suddenly disappear. But they're there. They're there, they're not seen, but they're still there. This is also an element that feeds suspicion from the very beginning. Suspicion is at the heart of the First Revolutionary Act, not because the revolutionaries are necessarily paranoid, because the situation brought them to, in a way, destroy or dismantle such a huge thing, which was the old regime, that feeds necessarily their suspicion or fears, because their own legitimacy is fragile, but a revolution is always something which is moving all the time. The context is volatile, and this volatility, the revolutionary spirit is all the time on alert, suspecting those he vanquished, because the vanquished do not want to be vanquished. That brings me to the question of hate, the hate of the old regime and the hate of the aristocracy. As I said at the beginning, the old regime was, in a way, it's a construction of the revolution. It was essentialized by the revolution as its total negative. And this hatred of the old regime, the question is it only something abstract? We invent the idea of old regime and then we hate it? Or is it exclusively ideological? I don't think it's exclusively ideological for the reason I've just explained. Because the old regime, in a sense, is there. The nobility is there. The old administration is there. They're no more in power. So I mean, the thing that was, you see, when the Americans have their revolution, the English go. They are on the other side of the ocean. The old regime physically, the men of the old regime are just around. That is one of the things that feeds revolutionary spirit. They are present, but invisible. This is something that can really nourish a little bit of paranoia. And even when these people rally the revolution or adhere to its principle, they are all the same, necessarily suspected. So I would say that the hatred of the old regime is nursed by the conviction that nothing in its legacy is amenable to the revolution, and that this legacy pollutes the revolution. This is precisely where suspicion encounters hate. And a fundamental feature of this construct, the old regime, is the hate of aristocracy. The hate of the aristocracy is, I would say, the byproduct of what would be called the process of equality. Well, there is a social hate of aristocracy that is already in the making in the second half of the 18th century. There is a pressure of the nobility on the peasants in the second half of the 18th century that was documented. Tocqueville describes very well this very bizarre evolution that the nobility is less and less aristocratic, and it has more and more privilege. It governs less, it leads less, but it has more privileges. So the social hatred of aristocracy is already at play before the revolution. But what happens with the revolution, with the convening of the States General, is that social hate is coupled by political hate. How? How does the hate or the hatred of aristocracy crystallizes on the eve of the French Revolution? In a very simple way. The nobility refuses the idea of deliberating together with the third estate. Nobility in France had no political role in the second half of the 18th, or very little role as a nobility, as a body, as a political body, as a political order. The convening of the State General gives it some hope to have a constitutional role. That is, to be some sort of a higher chamber. And they don't want to mix with the third estate. They don't want to mix with the third estate also for social reasons. What is the argument which is leveled by the nobility, most of the noble, in opposing any union with the third estate in one single chamber? They say that the constitution, the traditional constitution, always made them deliberate separately. And these, they say, the constitution is a fundamental constitution. These are fundamental laws that cannot be changed, that cannot be altered. So by referring to a fundamental constitution, the nobility nurses the idea that if you want the different orders to deliver together, you have to do away with the constitution. There's a huge debate on the eve of the revolution whether France had a constitution at all, and what was this fundamental constitution. But the notion that nobility is associated with the idea of an old constitution triggers another element of the revolutionary spirit, that is destroying the constitution altogether, getting rid of the notion of an old constitution. This is one of the elements that creates the old regime. There is another moment. So we move from social hatred of aristocracy to political hatred of aristocracy. And then we have the famous night of August 4th, where the nobility makes sacrifice of all its privileges, and this is the night where feudalism officially is get rid of or destroyed by a unanimous and enthusiastic vote of the National Assembly. But that moment feeds even more, I would say, the hate of aristocracy. The notion that, I can't go into the details of this particular moment, it's a fundamental moment at the revolution. Some of the nobles voted or participated in this festival of concession of sacrifice just out of fear. Because the country is in turmoil, there is insurrection throughout the country. But the notion that they sacrificed it sincerely very quickly is backlash. Because when, after the night, they begin to discuss the details of these sacrifices, the slightest misgiving about this or that article just raises and inflames the suspicion that the nobility was not sincere in its sacrifices. That in a way, by going too far in its sacrifices, they wanted just to make it impossible to implement. And here again, the hate of aristocracy, the logic, the syndrome of suspicion is inflamed once again. But what is even more striking in the, I would say, in the exacerbation of hate of aristocracy, the suspicion that aristocracy is waiting for its time just to take its revenge, that aristocracy is insincere, as that more and more the hate of aristocracy is not reserved only to aristocracy. Now it targets people, whoever tries either to defend them or have any dissent idea. Dissent in the French Revolution very early on begins to be identified with aristocracy. When, for example, moderation is denounced as a form of aristocracy, when people want to create, in the new constitution, suggest that the constitution has to produce some system of checks and balances, the notion of checks and balances very early on in the revolution is identified already with aristocracy. So the particular circumstances that produce the sacrifice of aristocracy in a way are become a permanent source of hostility or suspicion towards aristocracy, or to even any form of, I would say, constitutional arrangement that can be identified in one way or another with nobility. The idea of having two chambers is considered a kind of aristocratic conspiracy to reinstate aristocracy by other means, or I would say by revolutionary means. I'd say the hate of aristocracy ends up targeting just about everybody, even under the terror, when aristocracy has long been destroyed and exiled and deracinated. So, in conclusion, I would say that suspicion and hate are ingrained in the revolutionary spirit from the inception of the French Revolution. What begins as a rather abstract, depersonal, political passion tends inescapably to aim at individuals and groups suspected of embracing whatever form of dissent. But this, I was concentrating on revolutionary spirit and hate, I would say this by no means suggests that the men of 1789 were by definition imbued by hatred and paranoia. Hate shouldn't be considered as the root of the revolutionary spirit. Hate is the product of the revolutionary process fueled by particular circumstances. It is indeed the particular equation of 1789 that shapes the revolutionary spirit in an undefined war between the revolution and whoever is designated, for better or worse, as its foe. So the revolutionist period then, with its two devastating components, hate and suspicion, is the child, I would say, as much of the quest for equality and democratic principle as of political contingency, individual inexperience, and the abdication by the royal power of any leadership in the events it had set in motion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Halévi, for this very stimulating talk. That reminded me of a Bomo that I remember from Timothy Tackett, who said, it was not the revolutionaries that made the revolution, but it was the revolution that created the revolutionary. But I don't want to trigger debate on this. I'd rather open the floor for your questions. And whatever we thought that we might want to first give the students from Bard colleges just a chance to put their questions so that they can get into discussion with Halévi, and then we open the floor in the second round to all the others. So I'm encouraging you to profit from this occasion to put questions to Professor Halévi. And someone has to be courageous and to jump in the cold water, as we say.
So you talk about hate and suspicion, and I was wondering, do you see a timing? Does one come before the other? Does the hate come from the suspicion, or are they two separate things?
It cannot be separate. It's very difficult to make or to write a chronology of suspicion and hate. I'd say suspicion is the most important element and prevailing element in 1789, because there is suspicion everywhere. You know, it's a game where nobody knows the outcome. Nobody knows how it will end. And well, you see, there is a hate of aristocracy which is widespread, the hostility of the aristocrat, which is widespread at the end of the old regime. There's no use to get into details, but there is what some historians call the aristocratic pressure in the second half of the 18th century on peasants, and on not only just peasants, but on people who, in a way, had a new taste of some sort of autonomy. So when the pressure comes, if you want to see how ideas encounter sometimes circumstances, in Burgundy, peasants want to react. So they rent some lawyers from Paris to defend them against their aristocratic foes. The lawyers go to court and quote Rousseau, right? The peasants didn't read the social contract, and Rousseau is not a very widespread reader, social widespread reading. But I give you this example, how come into play through circumstances, interest, feeling, political philosophy, conflict, and all the elements that we'll describe so well about the end of the regime. The aristocrat is so isolated politically from the community. He lives in the midst of it, that he is not considered anymore as a kind of natural leader of his community. And these conflicts create a lot of suspicion towards aristocracy and sometimes hatred. So sometimes this hatred is individual, but it leads to a kind of general hatred of the notion of nobility. And you can even go further. So I revise my very first answer. In this case, hate comes first. But in the assembly, it will be suspicion. And it creates a kind of notion that, you see, the old regime fabricated negative equality in a sense, because it dismantled the old hierarchical society by devitalizing the old regime society. So this is also something we hardly touched upon in the studies of the French Revolution. We can call it a negative equality. The monarchy, the absolute monarchy, equalizes society, worsens society, devitalizes and equalizes it. But when do we move exactly from negative equality to a positive sense of equality? This kind of Burgundy, there are some other examples, it's obvious. A concrete conflict that produces passions, passions that encounter ideas and circumstances. But what I think, we can't have statistics about it, we don't have studies about it. What seems to be, to me, widespread on the revolution is that we're already moving from this notion of negative equality to a very positive sense of equality that has several expressions. One is, the hate of privileges. You see, when you give a part of autonomy to a peasant, he can rent a piece of land, and then the noble says, well, in my chart, you have to pay when I marry my daughter. From the moment someone asks, why should I do it? All the system crumbles in a sense. So there is a move from the negative to the positive. But what is so interesting, I couldn't be long about it, is that this social conflict or social sense of equality becomes political or shifts to the political level because of the particular terms of convening the States General. Suddenly they say, and you see, this is a thing that doesn't happen. The last time the States General convened in 1614, nobody asked why should we deliberate separately the chamber of the noble, chamber of the third estate. The question was not raised. But you see, you shift from the social to the political. This thing becomes the subject of huge campaign of writing, pamphlets, hatred. And here again, what is interesting in this political contingency is that if the king was a shrewd politician, he could at least try to work as an arbitrator in this situation. In a sense, France, when they convened the States General, there's a widespread feeling in the political class, this political class that will disappear, that things won't be the same. Too much happened. It was the American Revolution. There are many things. So the role of the king is crucial in an event he himself organizes. But he is a passive witness of this event. And this is why he is dragged into all this turmoil. And once he is dragged into this turmoil, then I would say the syndrome of suspicion really develops. Because, you know, destroying what they call the old regime, the feudal system, and, I mean, substituting one political legitimacy to another is such a huge thing that they live with the notion that nobody would accept it. And of course, he didn't accept it, so.
I have two questions that kind of go together. You said that the revolutionary spirit has existed before the actual revolution, but my question now is, can you also identify the revolutionary spirit before the revolution happens? And if yes, can you identify revolutionary spirit right now somewhere in the world?
When I said there are elements, the revolutionary spirit is such an elusive thing, it's a difficult thing to capture. But some of the elements are already around. What feeds the revolutionary spirit? It's the passion for equality. It is around before 1789. The notion of national sovereignty. The notion of national sovereignty is not widespread before 1789, but it is shared by many of those who will become the leader of the revolution at the beginning of the revolution. For them, this is a thing that is accomplished. But I have to insist on something I said too quickly during my presentation. The fact that you think that the nation, in fact, that what happened for 1400 years doesn't matter anymore, cannot continue. That is, this figure of an absolute king who incarnate embodies the fundamental legitimacy. It's one thing to think that that doesn't operate anymore. It is another thing to, I would say, to go into action and to implement this into a constitutional construct or into a revolutionary act. Many people come to Versailles, well, not many people, but many of the leaders of the revolution come to Versailles with the idea that the sovereignty of the nation is something obvious. But they don't know what to do with it. They don't have a plan to dispossess the king. They play with constitutional ideas. They change also. So the elements are there. What really gives the revolutionary is bizarre scenario is circumstances. We are in a very floating situation. It's like, you know, in a family, at a certain moment, it happened to you or will happen to you. You know you're independent of the parents in a sense. You have some kind of autonomy, but you don't translate it immediately or necessarily into a conflict. Sometimes a conflict occurs, and then this feeling goes into the open. It's a very, I think it's a fundamental and elusive notion about the beginning of the revolution. The notion was around, but nobody really knew what to do with it, and many people didn't think they have to do anything with it. In a sense, well, we don't do fiction about revolutions, but in a sense, we can imagine the king becoming an actor in a revolution where the notion of national sovereignty would be implemented because the prime legislator wouldn't be the king anymore, but the assembly. But things happened in a way that he was, not only he was dispossessed explicitly, that he became in a way the shadow of an old regime that in a sense refuses to die. And that's what feeds the revolutionary spirit. And it will feed it till the regicide, as far as the king is concerned.
In relation to the idea of enemy as a constitutive element of revolutionary spirit, and to kind of bring that back, or to relate it to hate, it seems to me that the objects of hate during the revolution were multiple. We can't really identify it or locate it in a single entity. And at the same time, during the revolutionary process, it also seems to me that there was no one enemy. As you mentioned, enemy could appear in different forms, invisible from within, for being active or inactive. And I was wondering, is this multiplication of enemies and kind of objects of hate correlate, coincide? What kind of relationship can we make?
I needed to concentrate on 1789, but the objects of hate, but I alluded to modernism, or just to political conflict that becomes bloody, under the terror. But the logic of enemy and foe, the more the revolution progresses, becomes much more obvious. And this excellent question of the Hannah Arendt Center is that, to what extent is it personal? To what extent it's political? And can we separate them? The question I asked at the beginning of the term applies. If we now move to the term, what is the amount of personal hate in this system of hate? I can't have a good answer for that, but I think it's a very important question. What I can say is that what really prevails under the term is the idea that any dissent pollutes the revolution. That the presence of enemies of the revolution in the midst of a revolution are compromising the revolution. The idea of, and its use, the word of purifying the revolution of its enemy, or its viruses, of all those who threaten it, is a deep-rooted conviction with some of the terrorists. It's not just, it's very easy to make them just assassins, you know, to just liquidate their enemies because it's easier than to discuss with them. But it has to do with something much more profound, is that the revolution is indeed threatened by any form of dissent. When Saint-Just says that indifference is a crime, that indifference has to be punished, he means what he says, that the revolution cannot prevail without being pure. The promotion of virtue is a fundamental element of the revolutionary process. You cannot promote virtue having enemies. And it goes very far, both suspicion and hate. It's another subject. There is an extraordinary passage of one of the promoter of the terror, Houton, who says to his enemy, "You're polluting the revolution. You're enemies of the revolution. You can proclaim, as you say, that you're faithful to the revolution, that you are revolutionary. You don't know that you became enemies of the revolution. You have to be a pure revolutionary like me to see that you are no more a revolutionary, that you threaten the revolution, that you have to be eliminated." This is an infernal logic. But the question is very pertinent. How far goes hate in it? How far goes suspicion, or just the pathology of the revolutionary spirit, where the element is the notion of foe, of an enemy, and of what Kolakov says so well, the idea of total salvation, or total servant.
If a follow-up?
Maybe we should give Alice a chance and we'll have a chance. I saw one more from the seminar, then we'll open up the discussion.
I think maybe, I mean, you've already touched upon the answer to the question, but I was really interested in this idea of how being a moderate is a really horrible thing during revolutionary times, that you sort of have to take a side. Otherwise your value as an agent in society is sort of completely taken away. So my question is, what is the main force that drives this radicalization during the revolution? Is it hatred, or is it something else that you touched upon, something like insecurity or something like that? And well, to what extent is extremism important for the revolutionary spirit?
Let me say something about moderation, because it's very clarifying, and it has to do what you asked before. They don't hate moderates just because they're moderate. They think that being a moderate is being incoherent with, I would say, principles. If you are moderate, you are betraying principles, but you're not coherent with the principles. If you want to have a system of checks and balances, it's inconsistent with the purity of principles, or revolutionary principles. But at the beginning of the revolution, it has to do both with hate and the notion of purity of principle. Why? Because suspicion is everywhere. I mean, I would like to really stress the notion that I don't think that all the revolutions of 79 are horrible people. I'm trying to describe a situation where people become what they become, as we would perhaps become. What happens there? They really did two huge, they produce two huge things. They dispossess the king and they dispossess the aristocracy. They in a way, put equality into constitutional terms, which was not the case in France ever before. So, if you, in a way, did away with aristocracy, the suspicion of the syndrome of suspicion brings them to think that a moderate government, for example, a government with two chambers, is a way of, you throw them by the door, you bring aristocracy by the window. It's an indirect way of reintroducing an aristocratic element in a society that just got rid of aristocracy. And a thought further is aristocracy is trying to cheat us through the system of moderation. Moderation is the system of checks and balances, two chambers. One of those who opposed fiercely this system in 1789 writes a history of the Constituent Assembly, and he said, of course it's logical to have two chambers because it creates a balance, reason, it slows down the process of elaborating the laws. It's a very good form of deliberation. The Americans are not aristocrats, they have two chambers, and it worked. But he said in the heat of the 1789, the wake of destruction of aristocracy, he said it was just not utterable. He himself, retrospectively, thinks that it was something that was reasonable, had nothing to do with aristocracy, but it was identified with aristocracy because aristocracy was just destroyed. And you know, kind of revolutionary paranoia means that any element that could sustain your suspicion is annexed, right, to revolutionary spirit. The revolutionary spirit is made also of that.
I think we should open the discussion up, and I see hands going up in Santa.
Thank you very much for a wonderfully nuanced talk. So I have two questions. The first is about this revolutionary spirit. And the question is, where is agency located? Because you called it, you also said it could be called an habitus, could be called a mentalité, but it sounds like it's a discourse in the Foucauldian sense. And if it's something like that, why would you say, for example, habitus, which has a more bodily, corporeal element, and that brings us to the terreur, where people, and also when you're dealing with a temporally very dense situation, where does change come in if it's a mentalité or an habitus, which needs to be sedimented in bodies and so on, takes a while. Do you want to answer first, or should I ask my second question right away?
I'll answer that. I'm grateful to you to bring up this element of habitus, which is distorting, well, it doesn't fit entirely what I said about I just like the idea of habitus, but
I do too.
Right, because as you said, there is a sedimentation. There's one element I should add. It's a sense of identification. Identification, a general identification to a movement. I think that the logic of friend and foe, or ally and foe, is fundamental here. Is the sense that you belong to a move, to a camp, to a, I would say, trend in history that is on work. And even when you do not agree entirely with everything which is done, in a general turmoil where things happen very quickly, you don't even time to anticipate. At every step you don't know what will happen next, you belong in a way to a camp. And sometime, or at a certain moment, you leave this camp. So this is why I didn't insist enough on it, because I think I have to elaborate more. The notion of the enemy of we and they is fundamental in the shaping of the revolutionary spirit. And the more, I mean, the revolutions go, the more this revolutionary spirit is evolves. as I said, this is why it's so difficult to capture. It evolves because event evolves, people lead the revolution. Those who were associated with the revolution, it's very easy about the moderates. The moderates in 1789 are revolutionaries. They are promoter of the notion of national sovereignty. They are opposed, they want to destroy the notion of privilege, nobility, hierarchy. But they want a system of checks and balances, and that kicks them out of the revolution, right? So they are revolutionary, but they do not embrace the revolutionary spirit. They are not in the logic and we and they. They are not defining themselves in terms of enemies. They are squeezed between two kinds of enemies. I mean, the revolutionary camp and the ruling camp. Right. But take the triumvirs, those who are revolutionaries in 89, they shape even the discourse of the revolution, and they embody the revolutionary spirit. They're out of revolution in 1991 after the flight of the king. But so I would say the elements are the notion of equality, a sense of identification to a camp, which is, I think, perhaps one of the most fundamental elements, and the notion of, or a shared notion of who the enemy is. And the enemy can be something abstract. It can be it's not only real people, it's the counter-revolution, it's aristocracy. I think it's a fueling elements of the revolutionary spirit.
Can I? Or no? Okay. All right.
I see other hands. Maybe we can
sure.
discuss this over a glass of wine. Right?
Sure.
Christian Eisenberg.
In private life, the opposite of hatred is not love, but indifference. And I wonder what is the opposite of hatred in the context of the French Revolution. Is it to have a blueprint for a revolution, and in that case you can't really stimulate a revolution because you get lost of the spontaneity of people? Or is there another possible opposite of hatred?
I'm not sure I have an answer. It's a very good question, but I'm not sure I have an answer. Don't have a lot of love in the revolution.
Well, you talked about moderatism, and there's another word that came to mind, which is tièdeur, which I have not no English translation for, but it's water can be hot, can be cold.
Lukewarm.
Lukewarm, thank you. So,
But he uses the word tièdeur, it's not in the quote I gave Saint-Just. Being lukewarm is a crime against the revolution. And I must go back to your question just in a second. As the revolutionary spirit evolves and shifts to the revolution, that's one of the reasons it's very difficult to fix it in a definition. It's a frame of mind, a formal identification, but that moves on all the time. It changes its targets, the identification of its enemy, of the threat it encounters. And this is why it's so fundamental to study it, and this is why it's so difficult to capture what it is, because it changes all the time, and you can't fix it on people or ideas or doctrine. I'm trying to give an excuse to my difficulties.
But then, in that sense, could it transmute to something as strict ideology? Because if we think of the terror and precisely of this camp of the we and them, and the idea of purifying the revolution, trying to tell the other that we kind of know better than you, so we're already in this totalitarian kind of framework, and in that sense, the personal and political are maybe the same, we can't really distinguish them, and for me that sounds like a strict practice of ideology. And you said earlier that the revolutionary spirit cannot be reduced to ideology. There are ideological aspects within it, but maybe in the terror, or at least this is how it seems to me, that this revolutionary spirit loses a bit of its elusiveness, maybe?
It's clearer under the terror, certainly, but not all the terrorists are imbued by ideology. I think that even from this talk, I get the impression how important an element, just to have an idea of the revolutionary spirit, is action. Action, political action. That's what Cauchin called l'esprit du Jacobinite. It's political action. At the beginning of the revolution, it's rallying and acting as a group against a designated enemy. And it's, in a sense, in a different context, with much more ideology, with redefinition of the enemies in new terms. It's a combination of ideology and action, because many of the people, I mean, not every person who participated or who belongs to the system of terror talks language of Robespierre and Saint-Just. In a way, Robespierre and Saint-Just put words on the situation and characterize them in a very striking way. But I'm not sure everybody acts only through clear ideological agenda or issues. It's the action, in a sense, and once again the designation of the enemy, the identification one has to one camp and not to another. In a situation where, by the way, the camp changes all the time. I mean, the exclusions go on and on. It's the phenomena of the revolutionary spirit that continue, in a sense, to prevail while changing.
There's time for one more question. And if I don't see hands going up, I can give Jan the chance to ask the second question.
Okay. So Daniel lured me to this talk by saying this was going to be in the history of emotions. I do the history of emotions. And I feel I haven't gotten my money's worth, frankly. Because hatred and suspicion both seem to be transhistorical entities. What is historically specific about hatred? How is hatred configured specifically in the fateful years that you're examining? And what do you think of a history of emotions approach to the French Revolution? After all, the single most important work in the history of emotions, William Reddy's The Navigation of Feeling, a framework for the history of emotions, 2001, has 200 pages on the French Revolution, speaking about how in the salons of the early 18th century, a specific emotional culture emerged among some aristocrats who were unhappy with what they perceived as the phony theatricality of emotional behavior at the court, and how that was then transferred into the revolution, and how these people actually had an incorrect notion of how emotions work, because they had this constant obsession with authenticity. In the Terreur, they would constantly self-examine themselves. Am I being authentic? Am I really in favor of the Terror right now? And of course, by constant self-examination, they would find impurities. And that's also why the Terror had come to an end, because this kind of emotional culture was incompatible with how emotions work according to a cognitive psychological notion of them being open-ended, hard to plan, overdetermined, and so on. So what's your take on that sort of history of emotions approach?
I feel I live on another planet. I must confess I haven't read William Reddy's book, but I'm intrigued by it. I won't use the word suspicion, but I'm always somewhat dubitative and perplexed. You talk about the transfer of emotion from the salon of the 18th century. When you get to the end of the chair with people, I have to read it, but I would, in the hierarchy of questions, unanswered questions that the French Revolution leaves us with, I think the most fundamental is this sense of identification that continue to nourish don't say habitus, a kind of mortality, a sense of group, a sense of a particular sense of enemy, and that gives to the revolutionary process its dynamic. That I'm not sure, but I have to read it, that any history of emotion can give us clues. The clue is really, in my sense, political. How continuous, I think it's the axe of perhaps not a new history of the revolution, of this very immense event, is the articulation, really, of ideas, circumstances, and contingency. I think that is perhaps this is the first place where I will look for answers, less than in emotions. And by the way, you can be tempted like Michelet to say, but when you have the terror, he said, le peuple est rentré à la maison. I mean, the people just dropped. I mean, it was too much for them. They are very concrete people. The discourse on virtue and all that was not for them. They just couldn't. And by the way, the unifying ambitions of the revolution left the peasant totally indifferent. It didn't work, by the way. The feast of the supreme being, all that. Is it about 4/5 of the Frenchmen just couldn't care less? They just didn't see what it was about. But when it was to confront the noble or to assert some of their rights on that, they knew what they were up to.
Yeah, thank you so much for this discussion.